Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone joining PRI's Digital Conference and this session on corporate sustainability reporting and disclosures. Before I hand over to our keynote speaker and begin our panel discussion, I would like to start with a few scene-setting remarks. Today's session comes in the midst of a rapidly changing landscape in corporate sustainability reporting and involving notions of sustainability information needs for investors. In terms of information needs, investors are grappling with a number of considerations, including how ESG-related financial risks impact companies' cash flows, whether issuers are aligning to sustainability goals and able to transition their activities in the future, and increasingly, the need to meaningfully report to clients, beneficiaries about the financial and sustainability performance of their investments. The challenges facing investors in gathering ESG data from corporates are well known. Investors need data that is easily accessible, reliable, and comparable, meaning that performance is reported consistently across sectors and jurisdictions, in the same way that they need reliable and comparable financial reporting from companies. We are seeing global efforts to tackle the challenges and gaps in corporate sustainability reporting. The IFRS, as it worked towards creating a global corporate sustainability reporting standard, from the European Commission, which is looking to bolster sustainability reporting requirements for companies, and from a variety of national governments in North America, Europe, and Asia, working towards implementing climate-related disclosure requirements for companies, often based on the TCFD's recommendations. In today's session, we will examine the evolving sustainability information needs of investors and explore the initiatives to solve these, particularly efforts at the global level by the IFRS Foundation as they work towards establishing a global sustainability standard. To start the session, I'm pleased to welcome our keynote speaker, Teresa Ko. Teresa is Freshfield's China Chair and the founding partner of Freshfield's Equity Capital Markets practice. She is also a non-executive director of the Securities and Future Commission in Hong Kong and a deputy chair of the Hong Kong Takeovers and Mergers panel. Teresa currently serves as a trustee on the IFRS Foundation and a member of the Sustainability Steering Committee. Teresa's keynote will focus on the IFRS's work towards a reporting standard, and following Teresa's remarks, I will bring in our excellent panel to reflect on the speech and take us through a discussion. We'll also be opening up for Q&A from the audience, so please do send questions throughout. Teresa, if I can please hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Morgan. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It gives me great pleasure to be speaking to you today and to share with you what we at the IFRS Foundation has been doing and in relation to the proposed establishment of the International Sustainability Standard Board, another acronym, ISSB. First, let me recap what we have been doing at the IFRS Foundation. Established 20 years ago to develop a single set of high-quality, globally accepted accounting standards known as the IFRS standards. Our mission was and still is to bring transparency, accountability, and efficiency to financial markets across the world. Today, over 144 jurisdictions now use IFRS standards. I should mention briefly our three-tier governance structure, comprising an independent standard-setting board of experts known as the International Accounting Standards Board, or IASB, which is overseen by the trustees of the foundation around the world. And we, 22 of us, are accountable to the IFRS Foundation Monitoring Board of public authorities' responsibility for financial reporting. The vice chair of IOSCO is chair of our monitoring board. Now, with our public interest focus, we continue to bring global solutions to global capital markets. Morgan, may I have the first slide? Or the second one, in fact. Or the next one, please. Thank you. We all know that the world has been inundated with an increasingly overwhelming landscape of sustainability reporting frameworks and initiatives, scorecards, and data matrix. Not much, if any, of them is globally comparable and or consistent or assured. This has been frustrating for preparers who keep having to disclose against multiple frameworks and provide multiple surveys to meet demands from investors. This has also led to cherry picking and greenwashing, which has become rampant and very serious. So September last year, as part of our periodic strategy review, the trustee published a public consultation to assess the demand for a global set of sustainability disclosure standards and to ask whether there was support for the foundation to play a role in this space. The feedback showed strong demand for improved global coordination and for the foundation to play a role. Informed by this feedback and picking up feedback from key stakeholders of the importance of connectivity between IASB and the proposed IFRS, and support from organizations such as IOSCO, the trustee decided to work on the preparation of the new ISSB under the same governance structure of the IFRS Foundation. And that was only 9 months ago. Next slide, please. The trustees made a number of strategic decisions, and the first one was to make it clear that we do not want to start from scratch. There has been plenty of excellent work that's already been done by leading sustainability reporting organizations, and we want to build on existing investor-focused frameworks. This slide shows a selection of the leading sustainability reporting organizations on whose work we are building from. And you will see that TCFD is, top of the list. Value Reporting Foundation, which has merged SASB and IIRC into a unified organization, and that was only announced last November. The World Economic Forum, and last but not least, CDSB, the Climate Disclosure Standard Boards. Not everyone knows that their framework, which is focused on climate change, was first published in 2010, over 10 years ago. Next slide, please. We want to focus on meeting investors' information needs, namely enterprise value focused disclosure that influence investment decision. The global sustainability standards, which will be produced by IFRS, must be interoperable with regional and jurisdictional approaches and are intended to serve as a global baseline. And I'll come back to this on the next slide. The intention is for ISSB to work on climate first, but it is climate first and not climate only. The new board would move at pace to other sustainability-related disclosures aimed at investors to decide which topics, for example, whether it be biodiversity, human capital, to prioritize, and public input will be sought. Next slide, please. Now, a global baseline doesn't mean that it is a basic baseline. It is expected to be a meaningful, sophistical, credible, and it should be technically interoperable. What that means is that the disclosures could sit alongside and be compatible with the company's traditional accounting information. The disclosure would reduce the risk of duplicative reporting requirements for preparers so that the information would be much more efficient. And the disclosure could also be incorporated into jurisdictional requirements that meet public policy objectives or other broader stakeholders' need. The building block approach allows jurisdictions which are more advanced to go faster and further. We do not want to hold anyone back. Whilst the ISSB disclosure standards would be developed alongside IFRS accounting standards, the intention is that they would be available to all jurisdictions, whether or not those jurisdictions require the use of IFRS accounting standards. So we want to be as inclusive as we can. And the global baseline, as I'm sure you have picked up from the press, has the backing of G7, G20, and IOSCO. Now, some of you may have seen this diagram on this slide because I think it best illustrates the building block approach. If I may take you through it briefly. In the bottom left, you have the core financial statements, the IFRS standards in most cases. The principle-based nature of IFRS standards means that company must already consider the effect of climate-related matters on their financial statements, but we need to do more. So in the middle, you have this global baseline of sustainability-related financial disclosure for investor, and we're going to start with the climate standard. Unlike the financial statements, companies would be required to report on forward-looking sustainability matters that are reasonably possible to affect value creation over the short, medium, and long term. And this is what we mean by enterprise value. For example, the middle red piece is where you might describe how companies should disclose the impact of climate-related risks as well as opportunities. And for each identified risk and opportunity, the impact on its financial performance. This could include capital allocation plans, supply chain innovation, or investments in technology, or just new business development areas. Then the larger box on top in gray reflects the broader sustainability reporting requirements, which may include reporting against specific jurisdictional public policy or objectives, or reporting to stakeholders other than investors. Now, this overall approach will provide investors and companies with high quality, globally consistent sustainability disclosures that are developed alongside the financial statements, but doing it in a way that allows jurisdictions to incorporate the relevant disclosures into their own specific requirements. May I have the next slide, please? To make sure that we build from existing initiatives and give ISSB a running start, the IFRS Foundation trustees established a technical readiness working group, TRWG, since April of this year. Members of the TRWG are organizations that have already done a huge amount of work to meet investors' information need. And these are the CDSB, TCFD, Value Reporting Foundation, World Economic Forum, and we also have a representative from IASB, and IOSCO and the International Public Sector Accounting Standard Boards are also observers at TRWG meetings. Now, a little bit about the work of the TRWG. This is threefold, and the work has been to provide technical recommendations for consideration, to provide input on consolidating the current landscape that comprises a multitude of initiatives. And this is a very important point. I think the IFRS Foundation does not wish to create a board which will compete with the existing sustainability reporting initiatives. Therefore, consolidation, streamlining, and harmonization is very much part of the objective and the mission of the ISSB. And the last piece of work that the TRWG is doing is to provide strategic input to support standard setting, prioritization, and planning. So as to the technical content or the technical recommendation, the TRWG is currently building out an enhanced prototype climate standard using the relevant components of the TCFD framework and the standards of the international sustainability bodies as published in a prototype climate-related financial disclosure standard in December 2020. What is important to highlight is that the work by the TRWG is not a substitute for following the due process the Foundation is renowned for in its standard setting. The enhanced prototype will be subject to the usual due process when the ISSB is established, and there will be public consultation before the final product will hopefully be endorsed by IOSCO to be the global standard baseline. Next slide, please. I would like to tell you that the trustees have been working at an incredible pace these past 9 months, together with the staff of the foundation, and they've been absolutely terrific. We are all doing this preparatory work with the goal of making a final determination on the board's establishment. And we hope that I'm delighted to report that we are all on track, and we hope to be able to be in a position to make an announcement at the time of the COP26 conference in November. Once it is announced, our focus will be expected to shift to the practicalities of getting a new board up and running, appointing the new chair and the vice chairs, and recruiting the rest of the members of the board. I do believe that the world needs to see more consolidation of sustainability-related disclosure so that resources can be directed to help with transition to net zero economy where it is needed. Whilst public views are still divided on the likelihood of averting a 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming, there is still, I believe, a narrow window for the world to act. We need to make a collective effort to keep temperature change to below 1.5 degrees and to avoid the catastrophic and long-term effect of climate change. I'm afraid there is no one single bullet to convergence, and we need a holistic solution with all the key stakeholders working together. I believe a comprehensive global baseline of sustainability disclosure standards, focusing initially on climate, will be a very important first step. So support the establishment of the ISSB and the ongoing consultation work as part of an important process to the publication of the first set of climate-related global baseline disclosure standards. I believe the ISSB will be a game changer in reining in the rampant greenwashing and facilitating better asset allocation and investment to where it is needed to help businesses transition to a carbon neutral and net zero world. That's all I propose to say, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Teresa, and thank you for your remarks. I believe that Teresa has ducked out from a trustees meeting and has to head back to take some very important decisions, I think, on the range of topics that she covered off in her presentation. And it's very pleasing to hear the sense of urgency and importance that the IFRS is placing on this. With that, I'd like to bring our panel in for discussion. I'll start by introducing everyone on the panel. We have Erik Thedéen, who is the Director General of the Swedish Financial Supervisory Authority. He also chairs the IOSCO Task Force on Sustainable Finance and serves as a member on ESMA. We have Michèle Lacroix as the Head of Group Investment Risk and Sustainability at SCOR. She also serves on a number of advisory committees in Europe in terms of EFRAG and also on the Technical Expert Group on Sustainable Finance and at the French Financial Markets Regulator AMF. We have David Semaya is the Executive Chairman at Sumitomo Mitsui Trust Asset Management. Previously, David served as Executive Chairman of Nikko Asset Management for 4 years, both in London and Tokyo. And we also have Wendy Cromwell, who is the Vice Chair and Director of Sustainable Investment at Wellington Management and is also a member of Wellington's Compensation Committee and a member of the Advisory Board of Wellington's Women's Network. Finally, Wendy serves as a Director on the board at PRI. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us. I'd like to start the discussion with you, Erik. Teresa obviously alluded to the role of IOSCO in her notes, in her presentation. I would be grateful if you could please explain IOSCO's role in standard setting for corporate sustainability reporting, including the work of the IOSCO Task Force and the role that IOSCO will play in the ISSB's sustainability standard setting work.
Thank you very much for having me on this panel, and it was really interesting to listen to Teresa. Of course, we work closely with the IFRS. Now, IOSCO, for those who don't know what it is, it's basically the global standard setters for securities regulators. So we do, CCPs, mutual funds, and then including disclosure. And we were, as it's been explained to me anyway, instrumental when the IASB was set up and the financial disclosure. So we set up this task force a little bit more than a year ago. Before that, we had a network, and what we found out was exactly what actually Teresa was alluding to, namely the kind of the alphabetic soup, the fragmentation of the disclosure, and of course being responsible for building a stable and safeguarding the integrity of markets. This was a problem for IOSCO and IOSCO members. So what we do here is to we all have a part in the governance structure through the chairmanship and in the management monitoring board, and eventually we have a role to endorse. Now that was also mentioned by Teresa, but this doesn't come easy because of course we need to scrutinize the proposed standards coming out from the IFRS process that she described. We have set up a technical expert group that basically are working in tandem with the technical readiness working group that Teresa was talking about, and basically putting our expert and bringing in our expertise and input into this with the kind of public interest angle to it. So before we do anything of endorsement, we need to be sure that all the kind of metrics and standards are in line what we think is reasonable. So the kind of hard decisions we need to do after the ISSB is set up and after the standards have been refined, you could say, is then this endorsement process. We are a standard setter. We are not a legislator. So what we do is basically that we could then potentially, and this is up to the board to decide, so I can't say that this will happen, but of course this is kind of the process that we try to follow now. If we go for an endorsement, that is a pathway to bring it into legislations and guidelines or whatever you call them in different jurisdictions and regions in the world. So it's an extremely important process because that would actually be the decision that actually could bring the ISSB standards into this global baseline that Teresa was talking about, and which is of course key again to solve the issues that we're trying to solve. And as we do climate first, it is of course to live up to the Paris Agreement of below 1.5 warming. So that is a kind of in a nutshell, maybe more.
Great. Thank you, Erik. That's very clear. I'd like to sort of bring in the investors on this panel in here, and perhaps I think I'd like to start with Michèle, if I may. I mean, looking at Teresa's presentation from a European investor perspective, and an environment that is highly regulated with respect to ESG reporting for European investors, what benefit could a global sustainability reporting standard bring from your perspective?
Thank you, and thanks for having me here. We have a lot of expectation of a global sustainability reporting standard. We absolutely need an harmonization of level playing fields. We have global portfolios for which we are fighting to get the data, but also not only getting the data, but making sure that all over the world we collect the same type of data to allow for comparability and to allow for aggregation of data within portfolios. I think also that we need a clear reference to what materiality means and how to tackle the concept of double materiality. We need to focus on what is material for a company to ensure the relevance of the information. But at the same time, we have a tremendous amount of data to analyze and to compute, and we must stay focused on what is important for the company as much as for the company on its ecosystems. If we start to have too many information that are not relevant for a company, then we will lose a lot of energy computing and analyzing data that does not bring value. It has to be kept absolutely meaningful. Meaningful from the company standpoint, but also meaningful for decision making. Hence, we need the right balance between materiality and standardization to make sure that we can at the same time increase the comparability, but not refrain from having specific information that can be useful again when taking investment decisions. We must keep in mind that all users are not at the same level in their sustainability journey, and some investors need not only information related to risk or opportunity, but already those information that are supposed to address other stakeholders. A lot of investors in Europe have already to tackle this type of other stakeholder needs that are usually contained in the word impact. So it's not only a question of assessing risks and opportunities from an investor standpoint, it's also a question of addressing the impact. If I just think of SCOR, we are a reinsurance company. When trying to be impactful in our investments, we protect our business model. We protect our ability to reinsure natural catastrophe in the long run. So it's not only about risks and opportunities in our investments, it's really risk and opportunities of the entire business model that can be tackled with having impactful investment decisions. Finally, I would say that yes, there is this data challenge that we need to solve to make sure that we can support ambitious commitment. We cannot commit if we are not able to track what we are doing and to demonstrate that we are delivering on our commitments.
Thank you, Michèle. I think there's a couple of points here, which Erik, I might come back to you after we've heard from another panelist. I think Michèle raised some very important points, I think, around this, the role of double materiality, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on sort of how this links into the building block approach that's being proposed. But I'll come back to you at the end of this in a minute around that. David, if I could please bring you in here, I'd be keen to hear your experience with current reporting disclosure standards and practices in Japan and globally, and what role you think the ISSB should play in improving these the flow of data for investors and how this would meet your needs.
Sure, and thank you very much for having me. Look, I thought the presentation that Teresa made was wonderful. It is great to see, as I think Erik mentioned, us getting away from the alphabet soup and all of the different approaches on standards and on reporting with a vision now of getting to hopefully one overarching, not only framework, but at some point getting down into the detail and providing us with data, material, how much materiality is there, but really getting to a single framework, a harmonizing framework that is would be very, very helpful for us here in Japan. I think we all can agree, and again, this is the view of Japanese companies, investors, clients, the asset management industry, that we all want to get to that 1.5, and we all agree on the 1.5 degrees. But the question has been how, and there is so much data out there. There is so much data from different providers, accounting standards, accounting firms, index providers. I can go on and on and on. And so we have almost too much data. As an investor, we actually need data in a certain way that we can use. And again, this is, I think, a great start in that journey. The questions that I guess we have would be, how quickly can we get to what would be a goal, i.e., is this process going to take 2, 3, 4 years? Because in that time, we're seeing more and more development of new quote-unquote green products. We heard about greenwashing. So I think the timeline is very, very important for us to understand.
Thank you, David. And maybe it's something I can also we can maybe sort of pick up with you, Erik, as well. I think maybe in terms of your proximity to the IFRS process. Wendy, can I bring you in here as well, please? For a global investment firm such as Wellington, you must analyse ESG disclosures from a portfolio company across many different regions. And these, I think, disclosures tend to vary by region. So what are your expectations of an international sustainability reporting standard?
Thanks for that, Morgan. Yes, Wellington is a large global asset manager, and we have 16 offices around the globe. Our home office is based in Boston. We have clients in 60 different countries, and we invest in issuers from all of the regions of the globe. So you're right that we're facing multiple jurisdictions and disclosure frameworks already. One of the things that we've been highlighting and agree with in terms of this panel's conversation and also the previous presentation was that we don't need multiple parallel, potentially competing frameworks that ironically would exacerbate the issues that we're facing as global investors and that issuers are facing as global issuers. And so harmonization across regions is incredibly important. Given our presence in the United States, we've leaned into engaging with the SEC as they are considering proposing rules for mandatory climate disclosures for issuers in the United States who are listed in the United States. Now that would cover 38% of global market cap. In our discussions with the SEC, we've emphasized the need to harmonize with other emerging global standards, and we've referenced the work that's already happened through the Value Reporting Framework, through TCFD, through WEF, and in fact, the work that's going on at the IFRS. In terms of the types of data that we're looking for on climate, we've emphasized the need to have more consistent, comparable disclosure by companies of scope 1, 2, and 3 data. We're already using this data to make decisions, and we're assessing and triangulating and buying data from third-party services where that data is often estimated. One of the comments that we're making to issuers is that it seems that they would want us to use more accurate data that they themselves report rather than having us rely on estimated data by a third-party provider that's often using industry averages to create that information set. Given our work on physical climate risk, we've also asked for location data to be disclosed. It's unbelievable that, obviously this is a low hurdle for companies. They know where their locations are. They know the sites. They can disclose the addresses. That would enable all investors to make better decisions and better assessments of physical climate risks and get those priced into capital markets so that we can get the capital markets working to understand and raise awareness of physical climate risks.
Thank you, Wendy. Erik, if I can just sort of bring you back in here, I want to sort of come back to some of the points that I sort of mentioned earlier, which is, I think you've heard from 3 different perspectives and 3 different sort of regions. How do you sort of see this building block approach playing out in practice? And how do you sort of see this extending into some of the issues that are raised by the panelists, particularly around sort of double materiality and going into sort of downstream data requirements?
No, I'll try to pick on some of the points here. No, but I think my starting point would be that this what we're trying to do here is to have a climate first international global baseline. Okay, if you have that ambition, you need to have kind of the some kind of common denominator. So, you know, you need to be really practical here. So if you ask me as a European, I would go for maybe more ambitious, maybe more of double materiality, as you all know, that's where Europe is heading. But then it would not be a global baseline. It would be a European baseline. So I think the pragmatic approach here is to go for something that makes a clear change makes more of harmonization that was pointed out by everyone here, which I think is extremely important to listen to. But also then have this building block approach. And it's clear already now that if we succeed of having this baseline, i.e. the European standard, for example, the kind of first building block is more or less the same as the IFRS, then of course Europe will build new blocks in their building block, and they will then of course have double narrative, because that's what they've been saying. So I think that's the kind of pragmatic approach that we are trying to adopt here. You could always say that we should go for double materiality, but then you have to give away the global approach, and I think that would be a worse off scenario. On the timetable, I really take the point on, it's kind of an interesting, I can bring you in a little bit to what we have been going through when it comes to the timetable. It was like 4 or 5 months ago, I sat in an FSB committee meeting. I would not name exactly where it was, but anyway, an FSB meeting. And I was more or less accused by some of the members of that group saying that our timetable, the basic timetable that was explained by Teresa, that was overly optimistic, it was too fast, it was not prudent. That was, some of the comments made by some senior members of that committee. And now actually I hear from some US colleagues and people I know from the US that we are too slow, because the SEC is actually pushing even faster now, which to some extent, I think to some extent has to do with well, anyway, they're pushing faster. So, but this was more like an anecdote that this timetable is kind of, it's damn if you do, damn if you don't. What we're going for is, and what we're hoping for is to have then the ISSB set up at COPE in 2 weeks' time. Then they start to work out kind of their organization. And the kind of most optimistic scenario I've heard and I've discussed is to have some kind of endorsement process within the board of IOSCO at the spring of 2022. And don't ask me exactly what that means for, when it will happen in real time in Japan. But that is, I think when it comes to IOSCO, that would be an extremely ambitious timetable. And this might, maybe in this group, seem to be, a given that we should endorse it. But this is a group. IOSCO is, many different jurisdictions with many different perspectives, and we need to unify and come to an agreement of an endorsement. So that's not an easy process. But having said that, I'm optimistic and think that we could have an endorsement by spring 2022. And I think that, again, it's an extremely fast process if you compare it with the financial disclosure that was set up a number of years ago. Some of you might have been involved in that. I wasn't, but people tell me that took like 10, 20 years. So this is still very, and this, of course, the reason for this is that we have this kind of running start where we build on existing standards that are already out there, which now are merging and getting together, including SASB and others that was mentioned by Teresa. No, and I actually wanted to also add, maybe from my point of view and to my fellow panelists here, there is, I think, an extremely important role for investors and also for the audience to play here. And that is because I hear from so many investors that you are strongly in favor of having a more harmonization, more of one baseline, because basically you don't like this fragmentation. And I totally agree, of course. But the more you push for that, the easier it will be for organizations like IFRS and IOSCO to actually can succeed in that, because this is political also. All jurisdictions have their favorite disclosure standards. There are vested interests in the different standards and so on. So if the international kind of investment community comes out and say, we want this, it will be much harder for, let's say, politicians or vested interest in different jurisdictions to go against it. So I think actually you have an important role to play. I know that many of you are playing, and you're playing it today, but just to say that as a message to you that this is nothing that is easy for us to decide, but it's much easier if you have the support from the global investment community.
Erik, those are, I think, some great remarks, and I think that thank you for that call to action for the investors. I think before we move on to some other questions, sorry, David, did you want to come in here?
I did have a question, because one of the things that wasn't, I don't believe it was mentioned, and maybe for a reason, but supply chain disclosure seems to be critical when we think about how we measure and how companies measure, their exposure. And we've seen that Apple is now moving ahead with their supply chain and disclosure. Where does that sit with where we are now?
Is that a question back to the panelists or back to Erik here?
I think to Erik.
No, and I think I have to pass on that actually, because that's I wouldn't know the exact answer to that, and that would be more up to some of the experts. To be really honest, some of the experts in my group, and maybe also to Teresa. I should probably know it, but I don't have a good answer. Sorry.
Sorry about that. Yeah.
No problem.
Wendy, I wonder if I could bring you in here. I think you sort of were alluding to the baseline, and I'd be interested to hear your sort of reflections on. I mean, Erik alluded to the sort of, I think, the growing urgency in the US, and if you're able to offer, I think, some thoughts on how you sort of see that playing out in the US, and sort of, I suppose, the appetite for I think, convergence around the global baseline.
Sure. First of all, I think the building block approach makes a lot of sense. I think that's the way that you're going to drive for global convergence. And so I appreciate the pragmatic approach. In terms of our discussions with the SEC, the way that we understand it now is that there will be a proposed rule likely in January of 2022 that then would go out for public comment. And, we know it will be controversial. There are interests on both sides. We try to emphasize that climate risk information is essential to ensuring good investment decision making, including, as I mentioned before, Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. So going back to David's question on supply chain, we do think that upstream and downstream disclosures of Scope 3 using GHG protocol or inspired by GHG protocol is incredibly important, and that using estimated data based on industry averages leads to less accurate decision making, and less disclosure and accurate pricing of climate risks in capital markets. So pretty problematic. I think that Scope 3 is tricky. Because a lot of issuers would say, how can we disclose our Scope 3 if we don't have appropriate and proper disclosures of Scope 1 and 2 by other issuers, because their Scope 1 and Scope 2 is our Scope 3, et cetera. You've heard these arguments before. And so you may see a call for phased implementation. We continue to emphasize getting as much into the public domain as quickly as possible. And that we can't really wait till 2024 to start getting more consistent and comparable climate information.
Thanks, Wendy. I'm just conscious of time, and I would like to maybe just shift tack slightly in terms of the questions here. And I'd be interested to sort of, I think, looking at some thoughts really about how we go beyond a lot of talk around climate and climate first approach, but also how we extend into other issues and the importance around that. And Michèle, if I could sort of bring you back in here, please. And even though we are sort of, I think, fast approaching COP26, we know that investors are looking at a broad range of ESG issues beyond climate when making investment decisions. I think from your perspective at SCOR, what do you see as sort of the main ESG issues that you think are likely to be coming up in the coming years in terms of regulatory requirements? and also your evolving data needs and what you're going to need to see from in terms of supply of data?
I think it's a multi-dimension question that you have raised. Actually, even on climate, it's not only about scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3, it's also about forward-looking type of information. What would you say on the financial world if you only had actuals from a company? You also need a business plan. So we need to have this scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, but we also need to have the direction of travel of companies and how they intend to adapt their business model to the new climate change environment. If you don't have this type of information, you're not able to take any decision. And that's when we see that it goes beyond only climate change. And it's not a question, I fully agree that it has to be phased, we need to have pragmatic approaches, but the climate is not ring-fenced to climate. If you want to tackle climate, you need to consider nature-based solutions. Nature-based solutions is, for a lot of investors, it's linked to planting trees. You can, before planting new trees, what about deforestation and trying to stop deforestation? And it opens the door to biodiversity. And finally, you see it's one calls for the next one. And it's kind of a puzzle that you are building, for which, of course, Europe is still leading the way, and especially France, because we have replaced the famous Article 173 with Article 29, which now extends what we were doing on climate change to biodiversity. And we already need to consider biodiversity in our investments from the double materiality perspective. But it makes so much sense to say, again, you cannot ring-fence climate to say this is climate and this is not. And you cannot stop the journey, and you have to move forward. I appreciate that a lot of people are a little threatened with this double materiality principle, but the inside-out materiality is more or less what may happen in terms of outside-in materiality in 10 years from now or in 15 years from now. Having this forward-looking information, being concerned by what you do, I always conclude by saying that our role, and I'm an investor, SCOR is an investor, but SCOR is also a listed company. We need to build a sustainable company in a sustainable world. If one of the two fails, or if we fail in one of the two, in any case, we will be dead. So we have to combine all of this, the double materiality, climate within the ecosystem, and with all the environmental topics that go with. And we have to move to the just transition. And everything is completely entangled. You can no longer have a look to one piece of the puzzle without having the big picture.
Thank you, Michèle. I think there are some excellent points around the dependencies of the issues. And I think it's going to be interesting to see when the IFRS announces their work. I think because Teresa alluded to sort of the forward-looking aspect as part of their sort of standards process. So I think it'd be interesting to see what is included in their standards when you're looking at this. And I think maybe particularly when they sort of release consultation, these points really need to be hammered home around the dependency and the forward-looking nature that investors need from the information. David, can I sort of come back to you here? I think in Japan, we've sort of seen a number of companies, I think, adopting TCFD recommendations, and this has helped to close the gap around climate data. But are there other issues within Japan or the region where we think further progress is needed from corporate reporting?
Listen, we've got there's a great, I think, groundswell for the Japanese companies to join what's called the TCFD consortium, and getting many, and there are many members, but getting companies to join is one thing. Then figuring out how to disclose and what to disclose, and specifically looking over one's shoulder at one's competitors or others in the industry and how far they're going. I think that's held us back a little bit. And so I saw, I think, a comment on the message board. there's things are a bit slow on that end, and I would agree. In terms of the commitment's there. You have commitment by the government. You have commitment by the exchanges. You have commitment by very, very prestigious business groups. I think the issue is brass tacks and getting down to detail and how much is disclosed in what format and how to go about and get the data. All the things that we're dealing with on the investment side, companies have to deal with as well. And they aren't necessarily as fully equipped as, for example, we are. And we're an asset manager with about 800 billion or 900 billion in dollars in assets. We have a number of people we've dedicated to sustainability. This is something that perhaps the finance department looks at and says, "Okay, we need to do it." At certain firms and at other firms, they're all in, and so I think it's really getting a number of these areas, clarity about the disclosures and to see some examples in the marketplace. And we do have leaders, absolute leaders. I don't want to mention names, but they're absolute leaders in the marketplace here. And over time, I think you'll see much more uptake. In terms of just the last comment on other areas besides climate, I do think deforestation and water are absolutely sort of the next ones, but we're going to face the same issues around data and how to categorize the data, how to bucket the data, how to use the data. Again, that's from our perspective. And the other ESG areas in Japan really started with the G, because we had, whether it be external investors or even internal investors here in Japan had looked at the governance models, and we've made a lot of progress during the Prime Minister Abe's administration, the last 7 years. More diversity on boards, focus on shareholder returns, which was less of a focus, much more stakeholder focused here. But I think now the focus is definitely on the E. I think the challenge perhaps is going to be around the S here in Japan. And how do we think about the S? Society is pretty homogeneous, and the ways of thinking are very homogeneous. So the S is really one to think about. Look, we'll have enough to do on the E side, but then the S definitely will take a lot of work and a lot of really understanding how that will work here.
Thank you, David. That's, great. I think again, we're sort of getting close to time now. Wendy, from your perspective, we are beyond climate. What do you sort of see as the next, particularly from the US perspective?
Thanks, Morgan. I want to emphasize that I 100% agree with Michèle that we need forward-looking metrics. And Wellington was one of the founding signatories for the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative last December. And part of that agreement and part of the way that we expect to fulfill our commitment there is to engage with companies to adopt science-based targets. And just last December, there were 1,400 companies who had signed on to or committed to signing on to Science-Based Targets Initiative, and now there's 1,900. The Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative was 30 asset managers. Now there's 128. And so all of us working together can hopefully get that number from 1,900 to something much larger so that we're actually decarbonizing the economy through our engagement. So totally agree on the forward-looking assessment and the forward-looking targets. And beyond climate and net zero, I think we also have agreement on the committee or on the panel on the focus on deforestation. Forests absorb about a third of the carbon dioxide released by fossil fuels each year, and deforestation contributes about 13% of anthropogenic emissions each year as well. So focusing on deforestation is an extension, we believe, of the work on net zero. and really understanding where deforestation exists and how we can decrease it is very important. And then to David's comments on water usage, that in fact has been something that we've already been focused on as part of our engagement on climate-related disclosures by issuers. We've asked for water usage data as well.
Sorry, thanks, Wendy. And Erik, you've heard from the investor side from different perspectives around some of the issues that they're facing beyond climate. I'd be interested to hear your very brief thoughts about what do you think global standards could play or most effectively fill the gaps on these issues, and where do you think the IOSCO discussions could help support that?
No, I think it's been extremely. But I totally agree. Also, I think I think I got some kind of understanding for the pragmatic approach. We need to start somewhere and to have this baseline to get it started. If you ask me personally, and of course I can't speak for every board member at IOSCO, I think it would be extremely natural to go beyond climate. And I agree with Michèle. Everything is interconnected. So how could you talk about climate with not talking about biodiversity or deforestation? This is extremely linked together. So I think that part of it is probably easier for a global organization, IOSCO, and for that matter, IFRS to tackle. The social issues might be a little bit more complicated, and I think that was also mentioned here. That of course this is different in different jurisdictions, but I don't see any reason why we shouldn't go beyond climate. But what I think is that it might be more political if we go into social, and if it becomes more political, it's going to be harder to have it on an international level. Again, investors could play a very important role here. If you push for it, it will be much easier for international organizations to actually adapt. So it's a little bit the other way around, right? You sometimes ask, why don't the regulators regulate? But it's actually, if you ask us to regulate, it will be much easier. And there will be jurisdictions that are very much against going beyond climate. Let's be honest. I think that's clear. So it need to push. But I think for me, it's a given. We need to go beyond climate also on the baseline. But I'm kind of 100% concentrated now to get the baseline on board, but fully prepared to take on other parts of the ESG that was mentioned here. And I think it's some really strong points from all of you on that one.
That's very encouraging to hear. I mean, we're running down to the last couple of minutes now, and I'm just conscious there are actually a couple of questions from the audience around Scope 3. So maybe I can just bring the panelists in here. Well, the question really is, there seems to be debate about whether Scope 3 is comparable across companies, and some claim it could only be used to track progress at one company, not between peers. Does the panel have views on the comparability here? Wendy, maybe I could bring in you here around this question on Scope 3.
Sure. One of the things that we've been focused on is you get a fair amount of pushback on Scope 3 because people say it's hard to figure out, and as I mentioned before, if we don't know an issuer Scope 1, Scope 2, how do we know what our Scope 3 is, et cetera, et cetera. We've been really using the Science-Based Targets Initiative framework as a guide as to how to prioritize which companies should be disclosing Scope 3. So via self-assessment, if more than 40% of your total emissions are coming from Scope 3, then that should be the guide. Something like that should be the guide. Now, if you're doing a self-assessment, maybe everyone comes in at 39% and no one feels that they need to disclose. So really looking to those industry averages to establish where that's going to be. And then you can do more peer comparisons and you can trace what's happening in the whole value chain, and we can make more progress in terms of understanding climate risk, but also in terms of mitigating climate risks.
Right. Thanks, Wendy. Does anyone else from the panel want to join in? We have 30 seconds left. Right. I think I do apologize for the audience who have sent questions. There are a couple that we haven't addressed, and I'm sorry we couldn't get to them. I'd like to wrap up with the panelists by perhaps offering each panelist an opportunity to provide one final message to leave with the audience in 15 seconds. Wendy, please, I'll start with you.
Sure. Well, I love to refer to the African proverb, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And I feel like the work that's been emphasized today by the panelists and also by IOSCO and our keynote presenter really emphasizes this. If we can all work together, we can make more progress.
Thanks, Wendy. Michèle.
I cannot more than echo what Wendy has said. There are so many collaborative initiatives that will make it happen. Anyone can join part of them just to become one actor in this transition that we must succeed in.
Thank you. David.
Recently, there's a lot of talk about multipolar world, bipolar world, fragmented world, and we're not using global. It doesn't matter what we call this. We have to come together and solve the problem. This is a problem for everybody. It's a global problem, and we need to join hands and be joined up to solve it.
Thanks. And Erik.
So very quick, global problems need global solutions. So please, everybody support the global baseline. I think that's one first important step to get this harmonized.
Great. And that just leaves me to thank the panelists for joining us today, taking the time. I'm sure the audience has found your comments and insights extremely useful. And for that, I'll say thank you. And please, the audience, enjoy the rest of the conference and have a good day. Thanks, everyone.